Well, you're going to be joined by Jim McKean, longtime Major League umpire, former umpire supervisor. And I want to set this up. Joe Torre, who, of course, is the Major League Baseball's executive VP, basically executive VP of baseball operations, sent a memo to teams on Tuesday clarifying Rule 713, which is the rule governing the blocking of home plate. Of course, the memorandum wasn't made public, but of course, it, as sometimes happens with managers and players and coaches, it quickly became public. The memorandum essentially instructs umpires not to call a runner safe, even if the catcher has blocked the plate without the ball, if there is no evidence that the catcher has hindered or impeded the runner's path to the plate. Now, you know that this rule 713 was overhauled going into the season. A lot of unhappiness on the part of managers, players, catchers, and frankly, a lot of unhappiness and a lot of discontent from what we're told on the part of some of the umpires as well, because there's anytime you change rules in any sport, there still has to be an element of common sense when it comes to applying the rules. And this rule seemed to, well, depending on the umpire, there were umpires that seemed to take it literally, and umpires who sort of just called the game the way it was called in the past. This clarification was to remind umpires that while the intent of the rule remains to protect catchers from violent home plate collisions, and let's get that out there, the reason the rule was changed is because there was a concern about home plate collisions and concussions. The wording was not to be interpreted so strictly that it would allow runners to be called safe in a technicality if the throw had beaten them to the plate by a substantial margin. Anyhow, this memorandum was made public or was released to teams yesterday. And of course, in the Yankees Tampa Bay Rays game last night, we had a situation that appeared tailor-made for the application of the new rule. And needless to say, Joe Girardi was not entirely happy with how that play was, that the play was ultimately ruled. We're going to see that in a minute, but I want to bring in Jim McKean, as I said, former Major League umpire, former Major League umpire supervisor, to join us on Baseball Central at noon. Jim, thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, great, Jeff, great.
That's all we need, right? They put another thing on the plate of the poor umpires.
Well, Jeff, I heard you talking just what you said now before about the umpires, and I'll be honest with you, the umpires weren't really ruling whether there was a line for the runner to run through or the catcher was blocking the plate or anything. All they were doing was calling the play.
Okay.
They were just calling the play that stood. They weren't worried about, because you can't do four things at once and make a correct call. So that wasn't even their responsibility. They wanted to say that the umpires had to look for this, look for that, look for this, and then make the call. That can't happen. That's impossible. So what they were doing is just calling the play and then sending it to New York.
Okay.
Then New York was sending the play back and not using the spirit of the rule, not using any common sense. They were just doing what the rule said, and then, of course, the manager would come out and go crazy on the umpires that are there, and the umpires just stood there and said, listen, this is not my problem. I mean, I did not make this interpretation. This comes out of New York. I didn't make this. I made the call that I thought was correct on the field, which they've done probably nearly 100% of the time. They've made the correct call at home plate, and I mean safe or out.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't even worried about the running lane or the catcher blocking the plate or anything. And I think they realized that the rule is not being interpreted correctly. Common sense wasn't being used, but that was all done in New York. That had nothing to do with the umpires there at the field. They were just making a rule on the call because you can't do four things at once.
Right.
So what they're trying to do and what they said to the managers, they reminded them to use good judgment when they decide to challenge plays at home plate. In other words, if the ball beats the runner there and there's no great collision and he's out by 20 feet, you automatically call him out whether he's blocking the plate or not because there's no threat of injury on the play. Now, one thing that has happened, the rule has worked because there's been no injuries during the season as far as collisions are concerned, but it's also backfired in about 6 different plays where it could have cost games, and I think the one in Miami did cost a game, and you guys had one up there in Toronto with Joe Madden where Navarro had the guy out by 10 feet, and Joe challenged it, and of course common sense prevailed on that one. And then Joe Torre realized, hey, wait a second, boys, we're going to go into the playoffs, we're going to go into important games now. we don't want guys being called safe. They're out by 20 feet and there's no collision. So basically what they're going to use is just common sense, and that's what they should use anyway. But it's pretty hard to put into a rule common sense because basically that's judgment, and that's in the line of the umpire.
Jim, my feeling is, and you said it already, there's so many things happening in fractions of seconds on a play at home plate. That's why I think this rule is very difficult, not only to interpret, but to institute something. Now, how do you feel as a former umpire? I got to believe you've got to want some control of the ball game, that you're going to make a call at home plate, and then they just send it to replay to New York. And then if the managers don't like it, you can't argue. Do you feel almost out of control, even though it's easier for that home plate umpire?
So that's a great question, and you're right. Except that you start to lose the responsibility, and as you say, is the management of the game. Generally, the umpires are managers of the game, trying to manage both teams and make both teams happy, which you can't do. But once you do something, and you know you've done it correctly at the field, so basically all the plays I've seen at home plate have been called correctly. I'm talking safe or out, and that's the main participation of the game, getting those plays right. It's not where there's a runner in a runner lane and where the catcher's blocking a plate. And now you're asking the umpire to follow the throw from the outfield from somewhere, get in position, see if the runner's in the lane, see if the catcher. You can't do it. It's nearly impossible. So what they were doing, the umpires are calling the play. Now, when those managers are coming out, Joe, what they're doing is just saying, listen, this is not my responsibility. I can't do it. I can't call 5 things at once. And the manager's saying, I know, but it's still a stupid rule. And that's how the argument starts. And I say, I hate this rule, and bam, 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 away we go. And then they get ejected. And I think the turning point was the one Miami with the right fielder, and Redmond, the manager for Miami, took his shirt off. And then that play, you know, he threw the guy up by 20 feet. The umpires called him out correctly. Then they changed in New York because, you know, legally he was blocking the play. But, you know, I had all sorts of ideas before the season started. Of course, you know, they try and do it by themselves. They don't let umpires get involved. That's one of my pet peeves. And all these rules that are made, they don't let umpires and players get involved in these things. They want to do it at the MLB level. And it's very difficult unless you're down on the field all the time. And Joe Torre, Tony La Russa, and a couple of those guys obviously down on the field. But, you know, I said, we have rules in college. My son played college baseball. And it was that, you know, you just make the runner slide. He can't bowl over anybody. He can slide head first or he can slide feet first. And very rarely do you get anybody injured on that play.
Well, and it seems clear, Joe, that there's Jim and Joe, that there's still some gray areas in the rule. There was an incident last night in the Yankees game against Tampa Bay, runners in first and second, none out in the fifth. Stephen Drew was thrown out at the plate by Matt Joyce. Now, Drew tried to slide around Ryan Hanigan. Drew said he had no clear path to slide. He was out by a wide margin. Joe Girardi asked for a review to see if Hanigan was blocking the plate, and you know, he didn't.
See what they're saying there now, Jeff, and I did see that play.
Right.
And Girardi had to get the memo yesterday. He said it reminded, you know, to use good judgment when deciding to challenge plays at home plate. And basically, Stephen Drew was out by, let's say, 10 feet.
Right.
So they're telling the managers, you know, we don't want you coming out on there and questioning that play, because common sense says he's out.
Right, but I guess what Joe Girardi was saying, though, is, and he's now told his players, you know what, just run over the catcher. I mean, right. It's gone from one extreme to the other. It's gone from trying to figure out a way not to run over the catcher to just now run over the catcher.
Totally agree, Jeff, and they're scared to death because they've had a little rash of them here. Well, they probably had 7 major ones, and they've had 3 or 4 just lately. They're scared to death going to the playoffs that a play like this is going to change a playoff game around our World Series game. That's what they're definitely scared of. But it really doesn't affect the umpires whatsoever. It affects who's working in New York, because that's where they're the ones that have to make a judgment on the play. They have to realize every time there's a replay, you know, somebody else is making a judgment, whether it's umpires on the field or umpires in New York, and it's going to come from New York, and they're scared to death. The umpires in the field just stand there. I know exactly what they're saying. I've seen 3 or 4 guys talk to managers and say, hey, guys, don't get mad at me. You know, I made the call that you think is right. You're not arguing here that I made the wrong call. You're saying you're right, but this is not the way it should be.
And I would argue on that play too, Jim. I would argue on that play that we can say that runner may have been out by about 10 feet, but if Drew comes in and makes a good hard slide into that glove of Hannigan, maybe he jars the ball loose. And to me, that's that good old-fashioned baseball that we all probably want. Drew avoided the catcher because by rule, I think now that runners are trained to do that, to basically go away. It's hard for Joe Girardi to tell Drew you should have run over the catcher right now, because I'm not sure we've seen one of those this year, have we? Since the new rule, the runners now are almost trained not to target the catchers wherever they are.
I agree, Joe. And the other thing is, and I don't know how accurate I'd be, but you're losing a step or two by coming directly down the line, then fading away and trying to get into a running lane because the catcher's in the way. Now you lose a step or two, and as you say, there's always that possibility of knocking the ball in the catcher's glove. I think when you looked at the play. This all started obviously with Buster Posey, and they hate to lose big-time valuable ball players to the Major League season. That was the big concern right there. And then they realized that's okay, but then how do we make a ruling to get it right? And they haven't done that. And until they improve it, it actually hasn't changed. This rule hasn't changed at all, according to what I can see and read. The rule hasn't changed. It's just that let's use more common sense when we call these plays.
Yeah, I was
you tell that to a manager, and the manager's following the rules.
Well, and I was suggesting if you're going to change anything, say that, and it's almost what you said, make the runner slide, but then, of course, you're going to have catchers just laying across plates and blocking. But if you say the runner has to take the path, what I would like to see is give that catcher the option. Every catcher in Major League Baseball, and last night it was Ryan Hannigan, he knows when he put himself in that situation that he may get run over. Some catchers can choose to stay at the front of the plate, receive the ball. Now, if the ball takes him into it, that's another thing. But that's what my point, again, there's so much going on that I just don't believe a rule can be made to cover all of these bases. I just think I don't think anything is going to really make this better. And I think everybody is on board that we don't want catchers to get hurt. But I think in doing it, if these types of plays happen in the playoffs, your guys are going to have a whole handful of trouble.
Well, absolutely. I don't think the guys are in the field because now, they
Sure.
keep telling these managers, hey, listen, this is not my responsibility. This is up to New York. And they're the ones that are going to make the decision. The way you talked is like I think all catchers would talk. I think if you interviewed most of the catchers in the big leagues, they say the same thing.
Yeah.
Let's just go back to the old rule, and I'll take the responsibility if I happen to get injured. But Major League Baseball didn't want that because, your Yadier Molinas and your Posies and those type of guys, they want them to be playing every game. They just don't want them to get hurt. And those rules weren't necessarily made to make the plays better at home plate. They're just to avoid injury. And what they're going to come back with, guys, is they're going to tell you, hey, listen, we haven't had an injury all season, so we feel it's working.
Yeah, and I think catchers will tell you that it's their choice a lot of times. You can make a choice if you want to put yourself in harm's way or not. If that ball is up the third baseline as a catcher, instead of crossing over the plate and going to catch that ball in foul territory and getting in the way of the runner and possibly getting crushed, you can just go right up that third baseline. That runner will be going around you because of the angle he's taken from third most times. I really believe a catcher can put himself in harm's way or in the way of safety.
I agree, and I think, and I don't know, Joe and Jeff, I've heard a little bit that the managers and catching instructors are changing these catchers really how to play the position a little differently right now.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking those throws really differently. They're doing sweep tags and slide tags and stuff like that they never used to do before. They used to get in front of that home plate and block it. I mean, I'm not a catcher, but I was close enough to see a bunch of these plays, and of course I didn't get injured, but I really thought it was one of the most exciting plays in baseball to have that big play at home plate. I mean, baseball right now, and I've said this to Jeff before being on the show, that, baseball is slowing down. It's getting to be very boring. The games are too long. They're going to have to do something in comparison to these other sports who keep trying to improve their game. And we're making rules that are slowing the game down again. And I just don't think it's a good rule. I don't think you should be able to bowl the catcher over. I understand that, and there's ways around it. But, when you jump into this thing like they did at the beginning of the season, which I thought was totally wrong with this instant replay, just jumping at it, instead of going a little bit at a time, doing a few trap catches and maybe one play at home plate, but they went full bore, and this is what they get.
Jim, it was good of you to join us today. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Always enlightening. Thanks so much.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Take care. It's Jim McKean, longtime Major League umpire and umpire supervisor.